tsunamis that kill nearly 250,000 people, viruses that kill millions, forest fires, floods, cancer. How could a loving God allow such devastation and suffering? The problem of evil and pain is one of the biggest challenges facing believers in God. But today we're going to kind of narrow our focus, so to speak, on what is often called natural evil. And our guest today is Dr. Sharon Dirckx, author of the new book, which I enthusiastically endorse, called Broken Planet. Sharon, thanks for coming on all the way across the Atlantic.
It's a pleasure. It's great to be here.
Well, when I saw your book, my first question was, what would motivate a scientist like you, with a PhD in brain imaging, interestingly enough, from Cambridge University, to write a book on why God allows natural evil?
Yeah, great question. Well, part of my answer is this isn't my first book on suffering. 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Why, and that was I used the model of interweaving kind of stories that people had of their journey with God in suffering, along with kind of apologetic responses to some of the questions that people raise. And the reason I looked at that subject first, as a scientist before anything else, and I have subsequently written on human consciousness and other scientifically related things, but the reason why I first turned to suffering was because often behind a scientific question can often sit a question about something hard in life or an experience of suffering. In fact, suffering is the most universal of questions. We've all encountered it one way or another. We all have questions to varying degrees. And so I felt that it was necessary to address this question before anything else. And then, of course, this more recent book is focusing in on natural disasters, which I'm sure we'll come to.
Well, there's a lot of voices that can speak into this. You can have theologians, you could have a pastoral voice, you could have a psychologist, but a scientific voice on natural disasters makes a lot of sense, and you bring some unique insights that we're going to get to. But before we get into that, I imagine there's a lot of people watching this, that this question is not just academic. And the last thing they need to hear is two professors explain why there's earthquakes and why God allows natural evil without sensitivity to the hurt that they might be experiencing. So what would you personally say to somebody who's watching this, who's just angry at God for not stopping a natural disaster that likely affected them and their family?
I would say that that is a completely normal and understandable response. And in a sense, I would want to say that whether or not, I'm not sure where the person would stand in terms of their beliefs in God, but God himself welcomes every range of human emotion and is able to handle all of our kind of different responses that we have. And actually, you find this in the pages of the Bible as well, that people bring all kinds of emotions to God. And you could look at even things like the Psalms. People are getting very angry at God in the Psalms. And actually, we're encouraged to be real and authentic with God, not just kind of polite and see him as some kind of distant figure, but actually we can be real with him about the grittiness of life and about when we do rub shoulders with suffering and tremendous trauma, that actually we can bring that to a God who actually knows us and cares and welcomes our honesty with him.
I really appreciate that. I teach a class at Talbot School of Theology in our graduate apologetics program on why God allows evil. And one of the first distinctions I make is between the logical or evidential problem and the emotional problem. And for probably most of us, it's some of both, but we feel the emotion. So to hear you say it's normal, and we even see biblical characters expressing their anger and their despair and their disappointment with God, it's not going to end there. But to feel that way and express that is very, very human. We have a God who does understand and meets us where we're at. Love that, and that voice really comes through in your book. Well, one thing I've really found helpful in when I talk about this is to frame for people what their expectations should be. Because I think when people ask, why does God allow evil? They expect me as an apologist to give them a reason why their uncle died of cancer, why this war broke out. And if that's your expectation, I think many people are going to be disappointed. So one of the things I do is I say this is a problem for every worldview. Part of the question is which worldview as a whole can answer it best emotionally and logically. When I frame it that way, I think it sets the expectations fairly indifferently. What do you want people to know about what you think are reasonable expectations for why they're suffering in the natural world before we jump in?
I think the first thing I want to say is that this is a deeply mysterious topic.
Hmm.
And of course, the older I get and the more that I've journeyed with the different people in this book who shared their stories from experiences like the Haiti 2010 earthquake and the December 26th tsunami in 2004 and wildfires in Australia and so on, the more I've kind of listened and journeyed with people, the more there's a sense of why this has happened to you at this point is in a sense unfathomable, much like it was for someone like Job, this chronologically the oldest book in the Bible that starts with this most universal human predicament of suffering, that it's unfathomable to him why this is happening to him. Now we can come to Job later, but I suppose what I actually say in my introduction of this book is we are not going to bottom out this subject. We are not going to package it up neatly. The things that people face in this world is so profoundly difficult that how could we possibly hope to do that? But what we can do is give a framework as to why natural disasters in general happen, why God might have made a world where they occur, and why that doesn't mean that his character is undermined in any way. So we can give that kind of framework that actually our outrage and rawness in the face of suffering is pointed towards God, not away from him. And I can say more about that later on. But of course, we want to hold together the deep mystery and the need to really sit with people in their profound pain as well.
So I guess one more quick question on this is not just unique to theology when we say there's mysteries we won't be able to understand. That's probably true in science as well, isn't it? This is probably true in every discipline. There's certain levels of mystery. Now, if we're dealing with an infinite God and his reasons are beyond us, it's kind of built in. But in the bigger picture of things, it's not unique to say there's mysteries that we probably never will know to theology, is it?
Exactly. Yes. I mean, there are many questions that science can't answer and will never be able to answer, and we have to kind of look to other disciplines for those answers. But yes, the idea that there is mystery. There's much about life that we don't understand. We don't understand, where our thoughts go, where dreams kind of reside. There's so many things. I pick examples to do with consciousness because that's another of my things that I think about. But of course, and yes, I think in general. Great. Yeah.
Okay, so let me just frame it the way a lot of people are thinking and expecting us to get to. Why do viruses such as COVID-19 exist in God's good world?
Yes, I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic is the closest, in a sense, it's the kind of natural disaster that has come to all of our homes. Very often when we're thinking about natural disasters of a different kind, we are either caught up in some big cataclysm or we are watching it on our TV screens and feel very distant from it. But in COVID-19, we've all been caught up, we've all been involved. But the thing that it's important to say about viruses is that, believe it or not, they are actually vital to life. The whole of Earth is kind of full of them. There are a quadrillion apparently floating around on planet Earth, and only 1% of them are actually harmful to people. they actually play a vital role in sustaining ecosystems, in preventing certain populations from becoming too dominant. They help plankton on ocean beds and have a role in making sure there's enough oxygen in the atmosphere. They have a role in human immunity. Lots of our DNA is viral DNA that's been built in over long periods of time. And of course, we know that viruses are used therapeutically. That's the basis of genetic engineering, some forms of gene therapy. Genes are introduced into genomes using viral vectors. And so they're not this kind of terrible thing that is kind of bringing great destruction. They are actually vital for life, but 1% of viruses roughly are harmful to people. Now, of course, that raises the question, why is there that 1% that's harmful?
Exactly.
Maybe we'll get to that. We could get to that in a minute. But the main point that I want to make, first of all, is to say that God has made a world that is life-sustaining. And so part of the reason that we see natural disasters of all kinds is related to the fact that God has built a world that can sustain itself, that is life-giving. But some of the mechanisms involved in that life-sustaining activity brings about, sometimes goes wrong, or sometimes brings about what we would call a natural disaster.
That's really helpful. I remember reading about how one of the roles that viruses do is limit the number of bacteria that are on our body, much of which is necessary and we need. And without viruses, we couldn't survive. So 99% positive we need them. But of course, right now, the skeptic is going, okay, if 1% can hurt human beings, couldn't God make a world where he just gets rid of that 1% or cut it in half? Or make it 1,000% and just minimize the damage so much, especially with this pandemic, that if I'm not mistaken, millions died from it.
Yes, exactly. I mean, here we get into kind of what is it that God can do, and can he logically do everything? Well, I think there are some that would respond by saying that he can't, just as he can't create a world in which we're all free, but also in which no one does anything wrong. He can't create a world with water in which there isn't the possibility of drowning, and he can't create a world that sustains itself without the possibility of kind of humans getting caught up in some of the mechanisms involved in that. And so you get into conversations about what is actually possible for God, and in terms of what is the kind of the greatest good in terms of what he was aiming for.
Okay. I think that where it's going to get tough for people is there might be a difference between saying, can God make a world with free beings and force them to choose good? Because that's a logical impossibility. On the flip side, when we're talking about physical things, it sure seems logically possible. There's no logical violation in saying that God makes viruses and they just don't attack human beings. Is it more that we're saying we don't know for sure whether God could do this or not? Therefore, we can't say that he's guilty because we're not sure how those possibilities play themselves out. In other words, in any possible world that God makes, given that there's physical parameters, cause and effect, there's going to be some negative outcomes, period. Is that essentially what the argument would be?
I mean, I think that there are a variety of different arguments, and certainly that would be one of them. Another one would be that, in a sense, that God has set up the world the way that it is. And someone like Richard Swinburne would, in his kind of natural law view, would say that the stability of that natural world is what enables us to act with free will that is genuine. Because if the laws of nature were constantly changing, if I wanted to pick up a glass of water, but suddenly the law of gravity changed, meaning that the glass kind of floated off, or that as I try to drink it, it stays in the glass. then I'm actually not in a position to exercise my free will. I'm subject to these laws that are constantly changing. And so I guess one of the views out there is that we need a stable natural world in order to live freely as the free beings that God has made us to be. But one of the flip sides of that is that those natural laws themselves are sometimes hazardous. But of course, it is more complicated than that, as we'll get to, that there are human factors that kind of exacerbate
Yeah.
some of these things as well.
We are going to come back to that, how the intertwining of natural evil and moral evil, which in the case of the pandemic, we certainly have seen in some cases. How big it is, we don't know yet, but there's that intermixing. We will come back to that. Okay, fair enough. Let's keep moving forward. Some might say, I'll ask it in a different way, different kind of natural disaster. That I think it was 2004 when I first started teaching high school. I remember this well. I just graduated from grad school. There's this massive tsunami that wipes out about 230,000 people, men, women, and children in an instant. As you point out, it didn't just destroy wicked people, however we decide that some people are more wicked than others. It wiped out all sorts of people indiscriminately. Why would God allow that? Because it seems like he could have stopped
Yeah.
it and nobody would have known that he intervened.
Yeah. So, where I really try to start with my thinking on this in Broken Planet is to say, look, let's just think about for a moment what we have to answer the question and to deal with our anger and sense of rawness if God doesn't exist. And if God doesn't exist, then we are in a closed system of physical forces and cause and effect and probability and all of these things. And that is what we have to work with in terms of making sense of why a massive wave kind of, kind of decimates a whole region. And that gets us so far. We can talk about plate tectonics. We can talk about human anthropology. We can talk about all kinds of things. But essentially, where you land is this is just the way the world is. This is what nature does. If you have a world that is, material and driven physically. And that gets you so far, and some of the explanations involved in that are helpful. But of course, on its own, it's not enough. It doesn't help us deal with, as you say, our anger, our frustration, our despair. Not least for those involved as well. And two of the stories in my book talk about someone that was actually in Sri Lanka as the wave hit, and also a doctor that went to Banda Aceh just a week after. Talks about how the entire coastline, you couldn't see villages anymore. You could just see the imprint of these villages.
Wow.
The villages themselves were 3 miles inland. They'd been swept in by the wave. The village that he was working in, not one family was left intact. And he tells a story of a boy that had lost his entire family and a mother that had lost her entire family. And the mother says, "You're my son now. I take you in as my son," and that kind of suffering. And so the scientific explanations that are offered in a materialistic universe don't really, as you say, they solve the intellectual problem. They don't deal with the gritty reality. To call something a disaster is to imply that something is wrong, that things are not as they should be. And science explains what is, but it doesn't tell us how things ought to be. But when we call something a disaster, we're saying things ought to be different than this. They ought to be better than this. Well, where does that come from? And of course, where I go in Broken Planet is to say that that is starting to point us towards kind of objective values of good and evil, of right and wrong. And of course, there are different explanations for where those values might come from, but you can make a strong case that the moral outrage that we feel in the face of suffering makes most sense if we live in a moral universe that has been established by God. In other words, our outrage makes more sense if God exists than if he doesn't exist at all.
I think it's interesting, your title, Broken Planet. It's like a broken vase, so to speak. There's a design and a purpose how things are supposed to be, and they've gone wrong. And our very protest against this is unjust, this is bad, this is evil, implies some standard about how things are supposed to be and justifies our outrage. If there's no God, and you would know this better than I do because you're studying brain imaging, then our thoughts and our beliefs and outrage are really just chemicals that pop up through our brain through this physicalist process that make us feel a certain way, maybe to better survive, but we don't really have justified outrage in an objective way, is at least how I see it. Now, when it comes to things like the tsunami and the flood, I remember reading a story. I wish I had kept the article. It's been almost 2 decades. Of sometime after the tsunami, it was raining. I don't remember how long. And somebody was complaining, God, it's raining again. Have they not been devastated enough? Then I read this story about somebody who was set adrift and was out in the water on some huge branch. And it was the rain that helped keep that person alive and not actually die. Now, that doesn't justify all the people that died. But that gave me pause. I thought, I wonder if there's so many things we don't know because we have a limited perspective of how and why this happens. That was maybe a hint that there's much more going on than we see. For example, I've seen studies that in areas in which there are natural disasters, there tends to be overall people turning to God in their faith and thinking about their mortality in a way they don't otherwise. Now, again, I want to be careful to say this as if this fully justifies it, but what role would you say points like that bring into the larger question of when there's disasters like this tsunami?
I think that I think you're absolutely right in that we of course don't see anything near the whole picture, the big picture in terms of what God is doing. I think, or why something like that would be allowed to kind of happen. But certainly, and this kind of a little bit ties in with the question of when people try to offer a spiritual interpretation of why something has happened, and is it because there's a particular thing or something that someone or a region has committed a sin, and this is the judgment of God on them, and so on. I think that it can be very hard to and difficult to try and impose a spiritual interpretation when, as you say, people of all faiths and none, people who believe in God and people who don't, there are stories of rescue and there are stories of people dying in all of those situations. But one thing that natural disasters do seem to do, and certainly something that the pandemic did as well, was to remind us that life is fragile and that it can end in an instant. And it can get us to really think about the bigger picture of life. If my life was to be taken from me tomorrow, would I be glad, and would I be happy with what I've done so far? Am I happy with my choices and my beliefs? And what will I do with the offer of relationship with God that I've perhaps heard from friends or family members? And so I guess pandemics, natural disasters can get us thinking about the bigger questions of life, about what really matters, and about who we follow and what life is all about.
Let me jump ahead to, excuse me, to a question I was going to ask later, but I think it's appropriate here because we've talked about viruses and we've talked about tsunamis. How much would you attribute the fall and the curse of creation to things like viruses and tsunamis? And if I could frame this in a certain way, viruses are good and necessary, so we don't want to say that all viruses resulted from the fall. We also don't want to say, because there's a design within viruses, that the fall, which breaks and corrupts, has creative capacities. So sometimes I wonder if the fall took viruses for good and was somehow able to just corrupt and twist what was there. I think things like tsunamis, in which we need them on some level for certain natural purposes. Maybe the world got corrupted, so there's bigger tsunamis. I can't prove that,
Yeah,
but I try to think how sin might have affected that. What are
yeah,
your thoughts on how much sin affects things like
yeah.
viruses, tsunamis, etc.?
Absolutely. One thing to say at the outset, and perhaps we can come back to it, is that the brokenness of human beings now has definitely left us more vulnerable to these things. And we can talk
Mm,
about the impact of poverty and climate maybe in a few minutes. But specifically to your question, um, so as you say, there are lots of natural explanations that we can give as to why these things happen. But I think I agree with you that when we start to dig deeper, and when I look at the world and when I read the Bible, I see that there are also spiritual explanations. There are also spiritual reasons that we can give for why the world is the way that it is. And of course, there are kind of two. Well, there are a number of different views, but I address two in my book. The first one, which is perhaps the most common view, which is that there was a kind of traditional Augustinian human fall that's
mm-hmm,
somewhere in history. Those earliest humans kind of rebelled against God, and that introduced a brokenness not only into their relationship with God, but also their relationship with themselves, their very biology, and also their relationship with the natural world itself. And we're told that the ground became cursed as a result of Adam and Eve's actions. And so, according to this view, the human decision to turn away from God has somehow had these kind of ramifications for biology and nature that has introduced a
mm,
brokenness. Another view is, that view carries some weight, but it also doesn't explain why there seem from the geological record to have been volcanic eruptions and earthquakes for many kind of hundreds of thousands of years prior to Homo sapiens even being on the scene. And so that view still has some questions to answer. Now there's another view which talks about there being a pre-human fall, which is to say, look, when you open the book of Genesis, and particularly when you get to Genesis 2 and 3, the serpent is in the garden already. And actually, the author of Genesis doesn't say how it got there or how long it has been there or
mm-hmm,
how much destruction has been wrought in the process. And so, this second view would actually say that nature became broken before humans did. It would say that the angelic fall that actually many refer to as being the origins of evil, the origins of Satan, actually introduced a brokenness into nature that precedes the human
mm-hmm.
decision to turn away from God. And so those would be two kind of theological kind of positions that are held in the community to try and make sense of the brokenness. And I could say more about how we see kind of spiritual explanations and natural disasters interweaving more in the New Testament as well. But maybe we can get to that in a minute.
Sharon, you do apologetics similarly to I do in the sense that I'll say, you know what, here's three possible responses. And collectively, they kind of help minimize the charge without dogmatically taking one, even though there's strengths and weaknesses to the different positions. It might be the educator in me that also wants people to think. So I
Yes.
appreciate that. But the bottom line is there was a common Christian view is there's some kind of curse, whether it's humans, whether it's a pre-human fall, that rocked the world, and the world will be redeemed in some fashion, the new heavens and the new earth. And that informs in ways we don't know precisely how that affected viruses, how that affected tsunamis. But
Mm-hmm.
as you see thorns now growing and the women have an increased birth and pain, it wasn't just spiritual, there's something physically rocked. So to me, when people say, well,
Mm-hmm.
you're just bringing the Bible in, well, in some ways, we're playing defense here against this charge. So it's fair to bring in the history of biblical theology and the scripture to try to minimize the charge. So I appreciate that. I think that's really helpful. Let me frame it in a way you do in the book. And this is one of the stories that probably stood out to me at most, because any parent is going to hear this and just be like, man alive, if I had the power to stop this, I would. You tell stories about certain parasites that have even eaten through people's eyes, including children. Now we see special love for God and Jesus in particular for children. Why on earth would God allow this to happen?
Yeah, yeah, great question. And the reason I refer to those is partly because of the YouTube interview of Stephen Fry by Gay Byrne on Irish
Mm,
national TV that went viral in 2005, I believe it was, maybe later. And he is referring to something that the natural scientist David Attenborough refers to about there are these kind of worms that burrow into the eyes of children, and people often ask him, as a, having made his life's work to look at the amazing natural world and behavior of animals and creatures and so on, why he doesn't look at the beauty in the world and suddenly believe in God. And of course his reason is precisely as you say, how on earth could I believe in a benevolent God
mm,
that enables that kind of thing to happen? And again, I think I would want to kind of come back to the explanations that I've already touched on, that if God doesn't exist, what kind of explanations are we left with? Are those sufficient? Well, scientifically, we might try and understand it a bit, but again, it doesn't deal with the rawness. Natural
okay.
processes are not enough. I mean, the worm isn't trying to inflict blindness; it's just hardwired to eat eyeballs,
Mm,
and so that is what's happening, and there's nothing right or wrong about it. It's just the way the world is. But of course,
mm,
you and I think, okay, no, that's actually abhorrent. We can't have kids losing their sight at the age of 8. Um, and why? And again, we're pushed back into this idea that we seem to be moral beings that care about each other, that care about the universe, that we're in the world that we live in. Well, where does that come from? Or maybe it comes from the fact that we're made in the image of a God who cares about human beings, that cares about children and them kind of dying from diseases in low income countries that people in higher income countries do not die from at all. And that's the other part that I would like to bring in here, which is that human actions do make people more vulnerable to natural
mm,
disasters. Whatever the old underlying reasons are for them, humans undoubtedly make them worse. And in the case of the eyeball eating worm, poverty undoubtedly makes you more vulnerable to having this disease. River blindness is probably what it was. River blindness is entirely preventable by wearing suitable clothing and by having the
mm,
appropriate medication. In fact, it's been eradicated in a number of countries through very precise action. And the reason that people still get it is because they just don't have very basic clothing, clean
mm,
water, all kinds of things that are just so normal and natural and taken for granted for us in the West. And so poverty is a massive factor that makes many people more vulnerable to natural disasters, be it a tsunami, be it an earthquake, be it locusts or these worms as well that you mentioned.
Seems like there's a combination of just human free will and also evil. So you said, for example,
Mm.
volcanoes. One, how volcanoes are necessary. I never really understood this. They pull up certain elements, help recycle them in the air. So they're necessary in some fashion for kind of balance in the ecosystem, so to speak. But people knowing that they could be in a dangerous area might go live there nonetheless and take the risk because there's fertile soil to grow. So it seems like there's a
Yeah.
level of personal choice to do this. But there's
Yes.
also a level, like with the pandemic, obviously it's being played out. Was this made in a lab or not? And that theory is not the point of this debate. But nonetheless, we saw some people doing very selfish things during the pandemic that resulted in other people getting sick and not being protected. We see this in places like, I think when there was a big earthquake in Haiti that devastated so many people, if that took place in Miami, so many less people would have been
Mm.
hurt. And a
Yeah.
lot of that is because of the corruption of their government. So, how much do you think human choice or human evil exacerbates or plays into
Yeah.
the natural suffering?
Well, I mean, undoubtedly by several orders of magnitude. I mean, the
Hmm.
example that I use to compare with Haiti 2010, that I have a story from in the book, is California 1989, um, which were similar on the Richter scale. And well, the numbers for Haiti are not really known, but it's somewhere between 150 and 250,000.
Wow.
And I believe it was 63 people died in California. So that is the kind of
Holy
difference,
cow.
several orders of magnitude. And I don't know who it is that said it, or maybe no one precisely did, but I would say there's no such thing as an entirely natural disaster.
Mm.
They are always a combination of natural factors and human factors. And we've touched on poverty. We could also talk about climate change, and I'm aware that there are people coming from different viewpoints
Sure.
on this, but the evidence does seem to be pointing to the fact that rising temperatures on Earth are increasing certainly things like wildfires, and increasing the severity and intensity, increasing the frequency and severity of hurricanes, because the temperature of the water, as that increases, it can pick up more and offload more water onto land, which is then having an effect on flooding. And so we can't ignore, I believe, the human the human
Mm.
role that we've played in caring for our natural habitat, or lack of.
I live in California, and every summer we have massive fires. And there's a debate about climate change, how much that contributes. And others would say, well, it's corrupt government policies, where they build homes, how much they do deforest and don't deforest. Which is true is secondary to our point here that there are some factors that contribute one side or the other. So it really is interesting the way you frame that there's no purely natural disaster, even cancer. Now, by raising this, we're not blaming cancer victims, but we're looking at what choices are made to put in pesticides or food or water, things like
Mm.
that we don't even understand. There's
Yeah,
human effects that are there.
yeah,
Famines are clearly affected by corrupt governments again and evil. That is
yeah,
fascinating. And I don't think we could ever calculate how much that is, but I suspect it's a lot
yeah.
more than we could
Yes.
even know and grasp.
Yes, and I think famine is probably lying at the boundary of natural or man-made disaster. And I guess,
Mm, mm,
sometimes it's man-made in that it's kind of war and
mm.
political systems that prevent resources getting through to people. Sometimes it's natural that the land kind of just doesn't, weather conditions don't enable kind of growth of crops. But either way, if you had irrigation, which is entirely possible, then you ought to be able to, water crops and so on. So famine is a complicated one. Another thing that
Yeah, please.
when you mentioned volcanoes, I was really fascinated by. Um, it's not just that we've become, well, another way that we might be more vulnerable to natural disasters is because we have lost an ability to read the signs of
Yeah.
nature as well. So, because I thought about this when you mentioned the volcanic
Mm,
story, because they talk in there that there are people that live in the crater of this live volcano, which is crazy because it's like a national park or whatever. Um, but no one has ever died as a result of an eruption. And the reason is they read the signs, and they don't just wait for the kind of smoke coming out of the vent. They look at the locusts. When the locusts start coming out of their crevices in their house, they know that it's time to leave.
wow.
And there are also other stories about, in the 2004 tsunami, about cattle that headed for the hills, and they knew something was coming. And some survivors were those that just ran alongside them and just kind of followed them, knowing that they're onto something. And so, is there something there that we've lost an ability to connect with nature and kind of read its signs? Yeah, it's a thought. really.
Oh, that is so interesting to me because I'd always kind of thought that was a wives' tale, so to speak. Not to denigrate wives, but to just use the common phrase that was just invented, animals don't. But you're saying there does seem to be something there, whether it's locusts or cattle, that sense when a disaster is coming. We don't know why. We don't know where it comes from. But there's a good chance we have lost that maybe by not being as connected with nature. And of course, not in some new age kind of fashion, but just
Hmm.
being maybe technologically, or maybe there's sin that does. We don't know what it is, but maybe we've lost something that's actually there, is the heart of what you're saying.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it's definitely worth thinking about, I think. Yeah.
That is super, super interesting. Okay, I've got a ton more questions for you. But let me ask you this: there's been debate for years, especially since the earthquake in Lisbon, whether or not we live in the best possible world. So you have a section
Mm.
on this in your book, and you talk about
Yeah.
certain necessities that we discussed a little: volcanoes, earthquakes, forest fires, etc., bring to life on our planet. The downside: we get rid of those, and we don't have a hospitable planet. You also make the point that if we get rid of those and make a hospitable planet, there's certain beauties that we lose. That was a
Mm.
new thought to me. Talk about that.
Yeah, so not only do some of the mechanisms that lie behind the geophysics of natural disasters have a role in sustaining life, they also create great natural beauty as well. So, tectonic plate movement, when mountain ranges are formed when tectonic plates push against each other over long periods of time. So the Rockies, the Dolomites, the Himalayas, the Alps are formed through tectonic plate movement, as are ocean trenches like the Mariana Trench in the Atlantic and so on. And then you've got things like the Hawaiian Islands that are caused from volcanic eruption and the lava cooling and forming islands, or the Azores, or any number of examples we could give. Um, and so again, these activities seem to be responsible for natural beauty. Now, a geographer spoke to me and said, "But for some people, natural beauty isn't enough. That actually, that's a high price to pay for other people being kind of thrown around by rippling roads and devastating earthquakes." Um, but he also reminded me that mountain ranges are responsible for the water cycle as well. It's only as air cools and rises that it then sort of falls through mountain ranges as water, and actually brings water supply to vast areas through the hydrological
Hmm.
cycle as well. And so that's why you see mountain ranges and a large river, kind of supplying water to vast areas. But yes, natural beauty is something that it's hard to deny, and it just again it's another reminder that this question is not as clear cut and as straightforward
Fair
as
enough.
we might originally think.
See, I'd agree with this. I think you said a geologist who said if it's somebody's life or beauty, I'm taking the life. That's obvious. But if we're looking at
Yeah.
a range of different collective reasons that cumulatively help us understand why there's natural disasters, if one piece is the beauty that comes out of it, that's not an insignificant piece on top of some of the other issues that we've been talking about. That's why I think when we want a quick Twitter response for an issue this complex, it just might not be doable. Now, I've never really been to the point, Sharon, where I've thought it's better to just not exist at all. I was sick a couple days in the fetal position after this stomach virus. It just hurt counting the time for 2 days. I mean, just it was miserable. But I think about people who go through chemotherapy for years. Like, I haven't remotely been there. But I understand some
Mm.
people think, Sharon, I've just suffered so much. Might it be better if I or we as a human race just didn't exist at all? What might you say?
I think, gosh, actually reading your question on paper and then listening to you pose it to me now makes me feel like there are two different planes on which I could respond. And
Mm,
the one that I was thinking of, what I would actually want to say initially is that we need to sit and feel the full force of that question, that there are people on this earth who have suffered things that make them want to contemplate it's better not to have existed at all. I think we really need to feel the full force of that. I feel like I came close to encountering people in that place as I wrote this book. I'm just reminded of one lady who lost all three of her children in an earthquake. And how and they were Christians, they were strong Christian family, and the person that was sharing this said, people have their positions on the sovereignty of God, but how do you sit with that? How do you find a way through that and still hold on to God? But of course, we have a God who holds on to us,
mm,
even when we find it hard to even take steps towards Him. And so I would want to say that actually we have a God who knows what it is to experience the very depths of evil himself, who didn't just suffer like us, but suffered for us by going to hell and back, to the grave and back, and glimpsing the full darkness of what it can mean to walk this gritty earth, and has come out the other side and overcome evil, so that the dark days that we see and that we face need not have the last word in our lives, that there is hope, that there is actually a way through, that there is a God who is the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who wants to comfort us in all of our troubles.
mm,
And we are told that by Jesus himself, in this world you will have trouble. And we're
mm.
not shying away from that. We're not trying to diminish that, but take heart, I have overcome the world. That suffering doesn't have the last word if God exists and if Jesus is risen from the dead. And that's actually what I feel like I want to say to you, although I've got
That's
other
great.
responses I could give as well. So
Well, let's pause for that, and then I'll have you come back and give your other responses and say, I really appreciate that. There's such wisdom in a Christian not launching into a quick response. Here's why God allows this, as there is a time and place for that, and sitting with somebody in that pain, which is a Christian response. Romans 12:15 says, be happy with those who are happy, be sad with those who are sad. So if somebody feels like I might be better not existing, the best response to somebody feeling that is not to say, what are you talking about? Here's 5 reasons why your life matters. It's to meet them in their pain, suffer
yeah,
with them, and in the right way, try to bring in the hope of Jesus to this moment. And I really, I've had some ways I've suffered in my life, not close to others, but my biggest suffering is when I've seen my kids suffer. And I don't
yeah,
have kids who have gone through cancer like some of our friends. I haven't lost 3 kids, and I do have 3 kids in an
mm,
earthquake. So I can't
mm,
imagine that level of pain. So I think that just that sensitivity you responded with is a model for how Christians should engage. But it's also a response from within what our worldview has to offer. So I think it's fair. If we were going to step back from this and just say, what intellectual reasons would we
yeah.
add? What might you say to that?
Well, I would say that how can we even contemplate non-existence when all we know is what it is to
Mm,
exist? So it's almost a question that we're not in a position even to answer, because all we know is existence. And to remove existence would, yes, I guess, remove all of the bad, but it would remove everything that is good about being alive as well. And is that what we want as well? And so I guess in order to completely objectively answer the question, you need to have an objective sense of the quantities of good and of suffering that are taking place in the world, in order to assess, is it better to exist than to not? And we're just simply not able to be in that vantage point to make that judgment. All we know is what it is to exist. And I suppose then that comes to, well, is there anything good about existence that
Hmm.
makes it still worth it, even in the midst of terrible tragedy and suffering? Or, in the words of Tennyson, is it better to have loved and lost than never to have loved
Hmm.
at all? Is there something about existing that still makes it worth it, even though our world is broken, our planet is broken?
You know, Sharon, it's really interesting. I was having a conversation with I have a podcast also at Biola. It's called Think Biblically, and my co host Scott Ray is an ethicist. And we're talking about euthanasia in Canada versus California. Similar laws, but I don't recall the numbers, but it's just exponentially higher in Canada. And one of the differences is that we have care for people, like hospice care, when they're dying. And he said one thing this shows is when we can alleviate suffering, the vast majority of people want to live out those moments. And, you
Yeah.
know, this truth isn't determined by a poll, but I think you're right. I think we intuitively know that the ideal would not be non existence. The ideal would be existence, but without that pain,
Yeah.
healthy relationships, which is the very
Yes.
thing Christianity promises built
Yeah.
into it. That's the beauty of heaven, as opposed to some religions. When you die,
Mm.
you enter into the mass consciousness and you cease being uniquely conscious. That suffering is done. And I resonate with that sense of just losing the self and all the burdens. But the idea of
Mm.
having that pain being gone and the goodness being
Yes.
there, I think that
Yes.
is the deepest human desire.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, not just in the new heaven, new earth, but also here on earth. Before that, there's part of our role as people that are made in the image of God, whether we believe in Him or not, is to alleviate the suffering of other people around us. And
Mm,
of course, we have seen that in extraordinary ways through the pandemic. We see it in humanitarian aid work. We see it in people that develop the vaccine in record time. Normally, it takes a decade. It took, 2 years, which is
mm,
extraordinary. We see it in people who are developing tsunami detection devices and people that enable you to predict when an earthquake is coming or when a tsunami is coming. And so we have a role in alleviating the suffering of others.
mm,
But the thing that's very interesting, and someone like Tom Holland in his book Dominion makes very well, that behavior, that action is inherently Christian. Actually, in the ancient world, people were left to their fate, and if you suffered, it was because you deserved it, or because you couldn't afford to dig yourself out of it. But it was actually the early Galileans or Christians that actually began to start helping people in those predicaments, precisely because they didn't believe suffering was a punishment, a
mm.
divine punishment, and because everyone was of equal value in the world. There weren't some that were of higher status than others. So these things were inherently Christian and are inherently Christian, and we've just absorbed that into our Western culture. But the fact that we help each other institutionally and individually is a God-given thing.
I think you're right. They're Christian in the sense that people are made in the image of God, which makes people, regardless of sex, age, intelligence, race, in the womb, out of the womb, rich, poor, valuable. And so we should care for them. There's the Good Samaritan ethic, uniquely built in Jesus' love and care for your neighbor. So, again, that is intrinsic to the Christian faith. I have two more questions for you, but I also think at one point I want to get out there is I interviewed a colleague of mine, Tim Muehlhoff, who wrote a book on common grace. And he argued how it's this desire to help and care for others. The fact that there is a world with medicine and we can produce the kind of treatments that you're talking about is a kind of grace of God's goodness built into the world itself. And again, that doesn't solve it, but it's a piece of a larger response. There didn't have to be a world at all where we could alleviate any of this suffering, but there is.
Yeah.
It's a kind of common grace. Now, you hinted at this earlier, but are you encouraged as you did the research on this book, how Christians responded to things like the earthquakes in Haiti, floods, famines, etc.? Do you see Christians stepping up and showing that love you're talking about on a wider scale?
Absolutely. Not just
Hmm.
Christians. I would say that people of
Hmm.
all kinds of beliefs. The people in my book happen to be Christians, but I'm aware that there are others that are pouring themselves out in helping others in war-torn regions, and really they are. And I feel like the in this book and beyond, they are the unsung heroes of the story of
Hmm.
natural disasters, that they are actually, facing just awful decisions every day. They see things in their lives that set them in counseling for decades to come. And, um, I think that I have been really humbled and really inspired by the people that I have met
Hmm.
in writing this book, people that are just quietly getting on with extraordinary work in the corners of the world that often disappear from the news very quickly. And yet there they are day after day. And there are many, many like that. And if this book can at least shine a bit of light on those kind of people, then it will have been worth it, because they're the real heroes of this whole story.
It was really interesting to read your book that you have the philosophy and the apologetics and the science, and you make a defense of the Christian worldview. But before each big chapter, you tell a story of somebody who is on the ground responding to the earthquake, responding to the tsunami, and the experience of what they saw. And it's unfiltered. You're not putting up a straw man that gets responded to. These are unfiltered stories. And before I ask the last question for you, one of the things that just jumped out to me is you made the point that so many times the people who experience the suffering might be less likely to ask why than the relief workers who come in. And that could be a whole conversation within itself. But I find that very interesting. And it could be that when people live in places where they see suffering more regularly than we often do in the West, and we can cover it up, that we just know the world is that way. So we're less shocked by the hurt and pain that is there. I had a conversation some time ago with a fellow who lost his faith when he saw incredible suffering in Africa. And one question I asked is, I said, if you pull up that country in Africa, they're one of the top 10 in the world in which there's belief in God. So suffering, natural disasters drive some people away. It drives others to the faith. I wonder if they know and see something we don't. And it's just a question worth pondering. Now, this research for you involved interviewing people. That also involved a lot of thought, reading books. Final question, how did it affect you?
Well, it took me deeper into the reality that there are no easy answers.
Hmm.
It reminded me that there are some things that we can say. It reminded me that there are extraordinary people in the world who have experienced terrible things and yet continue to believe in God. And in that sense, it was very encouraging to me to think, wow, if they can get through that and still have a faith in Jesus Christ, then
Mm-hmm.
then I can get through this. And so that it was deeply encouraging, deeply challenging. Um, but I think I agree with you that there is something about journeying in our suffering with God, some forms of suffering that take us deeper, and they take us into a deeper reliance on God. And they also enable us to offer comfort to others with the comfort that we ourselves have received from God
Hmm.
in that place of suffering. And so, yeah, it's been challenging, it's been humbling, it's been encouraging, all at once.
That's a great takeaway. I really appreciate the work that you've done. You've done some other work on consciousness, which makes perfect sense because you're an expert in the brain, so to speak, from Cambridge University, have a PhD. But the fact that from a scientist background, I think uniquely as a woman, that you would tackle these difficult questions of suffering. This is officially my go-to book on natural disasters. It's the best one I've read. It's not that long. I read it in an afternoon. In fact, and then to prepare, I went through it a second time. I enjoyed it that much. We'll be incorporating some of it into my lectures at Biola in the grad class I teach. So those of you watching who are still with us in this interview, we've just kind of skimmed the surface on what our guest, Dr. Sharon Dirckx, goes into in her book, Broken Planet. So I'd recommend it to read, share it with others. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And before you click away, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got some other topics coming up, apologetics topics, worldview topics you are not going to want to miss. So hit that subscribe button and think about studying apologetics with me at Biola. We have a fully distanced program. In fact, Sharon, we have students in the UK and in Africa and in Europe, other places and beyond, fully online. And I teach a semester course called Why God Allows Evil. We get into these very questions themselves in some depth and discuss them. So if you've ever thought about getting a master's degree, we would love to have you as a part of our program with Biola. Information is below. Sharon, really appreciate your time. Really appreciate your great book. Thanks so much for coming on.
It's a pleasure. And it's available to pre-order from Amazon now if anyone is interested.
Awesome. Thank you.